Good afternoon. We're back for about 10 minutes a day reading the Anarchist Handbook organized by Michael Malice. And it is July 29th of 2021, and this is episode 63. And we are reading from a long essay, Chapter 18, Morris and Linda Tannehill from The Market for Liberty, 1970. We're starting toward the bottom of page 244 today, so let's get reading. Each reparation claim would be a complex combination of compensations for losses of various kinds of exchangeable and non-exchangeable values. For example, if a hoodlum beat a man and stole $100 from him, the aggressor would be required not only to return the $100, but also to pay the victim's medical bills, his lost earnings, compensation for pain and suffering, and reparations for any permanent injuries sustained. If the victim were a key man in his business, the aggressor would also have to pay the business for the loss of his services. Each reparation claim is also a highly individual matter because the destruction of the same thing may be a much greater loss to one man than to another. While the loss of a finger is tragic for anyone, it is a much more stunning blow to a professional concert pianist than to an accountant. Because of the complexity and individuality of reparations claims, only a system of competing free market arbitration agencies can satisfactorily solve the problem of what constitutes just payment for losses caused by aggression. Murder poses a special problem in that it constitutes an act of aggression which, by its very nature, renders the victim incapable of ever collecting the debt owed by the aggressor. Nevertheless, the aggressor did create a debt, and the death of the creditor, the victim, does not cancel this debt or excuse him from making payment. This point can be easily seen by supposing that the aggressor did not kill, but only critically injured the victim, in which case the aggressor would owe reparations for injuries sustained, time lost from work, physical disability, etc. But if the victim then died from his injuries before the debt could be paid, the debtor obviously would not be thereby released from his obligation. In this connection, it is useful to recall what a debt actually is. A debt is property which morally belongs to one person, but which is in the actual or potential possession of another. Since the debt occasioned by the attack on the victim would have been his property had he survived that attack, his death places it, together with the rest of his property, in his estate to become the property of his heirs. In addition to the primary debt owed to the estate of the victim, the aggressor also owes debts to all those whom the victim's death has caused a direct and major loss of value, such as his family. Even though such people may also be his heirs. Not to pay reparations to heirs simply because they will also inherit the reparations, which would have been paid the victim had he survived, would be like refusing to pay them because they would inherit any other part of the victim's property. But suppose an aggressor murdered a grouchy old itinerant fruit picker who had neither family, friends, nor aggression insurance. Would the aggressor get off scot-free just because his victim was of value to no one but himself and left no heirs to his property? No, the aggressor would still owe a debt to the fruit picker's estate, just as he would if there was an heir. The difference is that, without an heir, the estate, including the debt occasioned by the aggression, becomes unowned potential property. In our society, such unowned potential property is immediately expropriated by the government, as is much other unowned wealth. Such a practice can be justified only if one assumes that the government, or, quote, the public, is the original and true owner of all property, and that the individuals are merely permitted to hold property by the grace and at the pleasure of the government. In a free market society, unowned wealth would belong to whatever person first went to the trouble of taking possession of it. In regard to the debt owed by an aggressor to the estate of his victim, this would mean that anyone who wished to go to the trouble and expense of finding the aggressor and, if necessary, proving him guilty before professional arbiters would certainly deserve to collect the debt. This function could be performed by an individual, by an agency specially constituted for this purpose, though it seems unlikely that there would be enough situations of this nature to support such an agency, or by a defense agency or an insurance company. Insurance companies would be the most likely to take care of this kind of aggression in order to deter violence and gain customer goodwill. Before taking up the means by which an aggressor would be forced to pay reparations, if force were necessary, the position of an uninsured victim of aggression will be examined briefly. Whenever a demand for a service exists, the market moves to fill it. For this reason, a man who was uninsured would also have access to defense services and arbitration agencies. But although he would have a similar recourse to justice, the uninsured man would find that his lack of foresight had put him at a disadvantage in several ways. The uninsured victim would not receive immediate compensation, but would have to wait until the aggressor paid reparations, which might involve a span of years if the aggressor didn't have the money to discharge the debt immediately and had to pay it off in installments. Similarly, he would run the risk of being forced to forego all or most of his compensation if the aggressor were not caught, died before being able to complete payment, or had incurred a debt too large to pay during his life. Also, the uninsured victim would have to bear all costs of apprehending the aggressor and, if necessary, of arbitration, until the aggressor was able to pay them back. In addition to these monetary disadvantages, he would be put to extra inconvenience. If he wished to collect reparations, he would have to detect and apprehend the aggressor himself, or, more likely, hire a defense agency to do it for him. He would also have to make his own arrangements for arbitration. Taking everything into consideration, a man would find aggression insurance well worth the expense, and there is little doubt that most people would have it. The next section is titled Rectification of Injustice. Since aggression would be dealt with by forcing the aggressor to repay his victim for the damage caused whenever the use of force was required, rather than by destroying values belonging to the aggressor, the free market would evolve a reparations payment system vastly superior to and different from the present governmental prisons. If the aggressor had the money to make his entire reparations payment immediately, or could sell enough property to raise the money, he would do so and be free to go his way with no more than a heavy financial loss. Situations of this kind, however, would probably be very rare, because aggression is expensive. Even a small theft or destruction can quickly pile up a fairly large debt when related expenses, secondary payments to others who have suffered because of the victim's loss, cost of defense and arbitration, etc., are taken into account. In a totally free society, men tend to be financially successful according to their merit. Few successful men would desire to commit aggression. Few unsuccessful men could afford to make immediate payment for it. Assuming the aggressor could not make immediate payment of his entire debt, the method used to collect it would depend on the amount involved, the nature of the aggression, the aggressor's past record and present attitude, and any other pertinent variables. Several approaches suggest themselves. If the aggression were not of a violent nature and the aggressor had a record of trustworthiness, it might be sufficient to leave him free and arrange a regular schedule of payments, just as would be done for any ordinary debt. If the aggressor could not be trusted to make regular payments, a voluntary arrangement could be made between the insurance company, the aggressor, and his employer, whereby the employer would be compensated for deducting the reparations payment from the aggressor's earnings each pay period. If the aggressor were unable to find or hold a job because employers were unwilling to risk hiring him, he might have to seek employment from a company which made a practice of accepting untrustworthy workers at lower than market wages. In an economy of full employment, some companies would be motivated to adopt such a practice in order to reach new sources of labor. Although the price of their product would remain close to that of their competitors, as prices are determined by supply and demand, the wages they paid would necessarily be lower to compensate for the extra risk involved in hiring employees of dubious character. If the facts indicated that the aggressor was of an untrustworthy and or violent nature, he would have to work off his debt while under some degree of confinement. The confinement would be provided by rectification companies, firms specializing in this field, who would maintain debtors' workhouses. Use of the term prison is avoided here because of the connotations of value destruction attached to it. The labor of the men confined would be furnished to any company seeking assured sources of labor, either by locating the debtors' workhouses adjacent to their plants or by transporting the debtors to work each day. The debtors would work on jobs for wages, just as would ordinary employees, but the largest part of their earnings would be used to make reparations payments, with most of the rest going for their room and board, maintenance of the premises, guards, etc. To ensure against refusal to work, the reparations payment would be deducted from each pay before room and board costs, so that if a man refused to work, he would not eat, or at most would eat only a very minimal diet. And we will wrap up right there, about 2/3 of the way down, page 248. 10 minutes a day reading the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we'll see you tomorrow.